morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on the region where you are. This webinar is about how to compose tables, how to make them really accessible in an effective way, to make the reader get the content of the table. So let's start with the definition of a table, and that's a standard definition from Wikipedia. Nothing special, we all know that probably. And a table is an arrangement of data in rows and columns, or possibly in a more complex structure. And that's a quite plain, easy definition. Let's move to a different way of defining a table. This is how Robert Bringarst, in his book The Elements of Typographic Style, talks about tables. If a table is not plain in a readable form, the designer, the typographer, can render it readable only by redesigning it from scratch. So that's a different point of view. It's the designer point of view that say, okay, it's if the table is not understandable, you have to step back, and think again about how to communicate the content of the table. And so the content comes in, and that's important, the part that interests us today. And moving on to the Matterhorn protocol, which is a list of good and bad things that you can do in an accessible PDF, in a PDF UA. There is a specific paragraph about tables in the Matterhorn protocol, and defines, and first it refers to regular or irregular tables. A regular tables is when the number of cell in each row is equal, is the same for the entire table. And the Matterhorn protocol says that irregular tables are not prohibited, but whenever you find an irregular table, it's a strong indicator that something is going wrong in the table structure. Probably it is an improper structure. And that means that a table to be accessible should be regular for an easy understanding of the content. Now we see some cases of bad table first, and then how to fix them and how to use a good design of tables for accessibility. First, a couple of examples of tables that are actually not tables or fake tables. This one is really used. You can find it a lot of times in layouts and design. This is not a table. The designer actually used the table to put elements on the page or on a part of the page, and use cells to lay out the content. So the first cell is just an icon, and the second cell is not a cell of a table. It's regular content. And all these examples are taken from real publications. Another example is when the table is used to compose a list of items or concepts, and in this case it's an improper use of the table, and that's not a table. Again, it's a kind of use of the designer is trying to use the table as a layout tool to organize the content, and this is creating this could potentially create a lot of problems to a reader that cannot see the content and use accessibility structure to navigate through the content. Because in this case, the reader finds a table, and actually the header of the table is not correctly organized or do not match the rest of the table. And inside the table, the reader expects to find some useful content, some meaning content, but in fact, in the first column, it finds just numbers from 1 to whatever, and plain definition on the second columns. So in this case, this is not a real table. Okay, this is where just 2 examples of something that appears to be a table, but it's not. I will show some tips to resolve those cases. Then there are the terrible noisy tables, and this is too much to be read as a table. I'm sure that you can find a lot of these tables in books, especially in school books, in science books. The author here, the editor, tried to use the table to organize graphically the content, a flow chart or some visual workflow on the page. But again, the table is not the right tool. This will be probably an image, okay, or something different than a table. This is too much, and when it's too much, it's not a table anymore. How we can understand easily when a table is good or not. A good table, if a table is good, can be described over the phone or without seeing it as well. Okay, so if I can describe a table now to you without showing you the table, that's fine. I can tell you there are a certain amount of columns and there are rows, and each column is dedicated to a specific content. So then I can start to read the content of the table, and based on the index of the column, you can understand what I'm describing. Okay, if the table is too complex or does not define correctly its content, it's not a good table, and I cannot describe it without showing you the table actually. Okay, for the same reason, accessible table should be possible to read starting from any point of the table. I can point to a cell in a table, and immediately I can recognize what is the content I'm pointing to, and what is the definition of the column, and which record is shown in the row. Okay, and for the same reason, repeating things in a table is not a bad thing. We'll see an example in a moment. So let's see some common mistakes that we all do every day on tables. This is probably the most common. This is a table that works. It's taken from an operating manual of a refrigerator, I think. And the problem is that in the first column there are some empty cells. So if I read the table starting from the third row, for example, there is nothing in the cell. So I have to guess that the first column is the column of the problems, and the problem is probably the problem that is described in the first row, but I'm not there. But I'm guessing it. I'm not sure. Okay, if the problem is the one stated in the first row, and I'm guessing it with my mind, looking at the table. If I am blind and I access to this table starting from the third row, I have no way to guess what the problem is, what is the content of the first row. Okay, and this is almost always connected to empty cells. Another common mistake is not describing what's the content of the columns. Okay, this is again from a refrigerator manual, and well, even we have no way to know exactly what the first column describes. Is it an icon? Is it written on the device? Is it something displayed on the display? We don't know. So headers are 100% important and are mandatory in accessibility. Another very common mistake, and this is it's a bit difficult to fix, is when the headers describe the content, but they are overloaded of informations. In this example, we have, for example, on the first row, we have the copy paper item. In the second column, we have the mean value, and the mean value is 10. If we read the table, the mean value is 10, but actually it's not 10. It's 10.0 pH. So the unit is part of the content, not part of the header. This is a very common mistake, and sometimes grows up to very complicated headers. Again, the header should be made of one row, really describing what is the content of the column without adding too much information. In this case, the pH unit should be repeated on every cell. Yes, that's the way to read the table, because I should be able to enter the table on any of the rows and be able to get the value 10.0 or 8.7 is a pH unit. Okay, this is what I call the Tetris table, as when the cells start to occupy the space of other cells, and again, the reader must guess what's going on. Okay, if this problem appears on the bottom of the table, far from the headers, it's even more difficult. Okay, for example, in the last rows of this table, we have inside image, and we have to guess if it's a category, if it's an item, if it's a mix of the two, why inside image and family hub uplink occupies more than one row. It's not clear. Okay, and it's almost impossible to understand if we look at the table from the perspective of the accessibility, because we don't know what the content is referring to. Okay, and we cannot read the column or the row independently. So it's always about the content. The best practice in this case is first always have a connection, a channel of communication with the creator of the table or with the editor, because mostly we have to go back to the editor or to the content creator and find a path, find a way to modify the table and make it more accessible. Avoid to group cells. This creates a lot of problems to blind readers. And measurement units always goes into cells because they are part of the content, part of the numbers, not part of the headers. That's a very common mistake. And make to check the table before publishing it, just try to read the table starting from a random cell, okay, from any of the cell, or reading a single row or a single column, isolate the content and try to understand what the table is telling. If it works, it's okay. If you have to think too much about the content, it's not okay. And always format lists as lists and not as table. Do not use table to make lists. Couple of examples of good tables. This is a very good table. It's from a catalog of outdoor equipment, and there are headers. The measurement units are into the cells, and it's very intelligent. If you see the last column, it's an empty column. There is no data there, but it is explicitated. We have a dash that means there is no data here. And but what I find most useful are the colored content where the infographics are used along with typography and plain content. So we have a visual reference and also a content reference. This is a perfect example or a very good design table that can be accessible in the right way. This is another good example, and you see that in the last column the value is always the same, and the content is repeated. That's good, because if I access to this table starting from a column, from the last column, I can see at a glance that there are a lot of items with that value. There are 20 or more items with the same value, and that's an information when you read this table. It's an important information. It could be an important information in the context. And at the same time, if I access to a row and I isolate the content of that row, I add that information. It's not an information shared to a certain amount of rows. Any rows has its content. It's a very good table. Some people may say, okay, no, you have repeated too much. It's not the case. For accessibility, you have to repeat. Finally, a couple of tips to solve some of the common problems. This is again the first example I show. It's a table that is not a table. In this case, you have not to fix the table, you have to decompose the table, to disassemble it and create a different structure in your layout. The icon is an artifact or a symbol character, and the text is just regular paragraph text. Same thing with the list tables. Let's call them like that. They have to be disassembled and put on the layout as regular text, organized with numbered list, ordered list, or dash lists. Okay, I try to condense in 20 minutes some of the examples, some of the main problems you may have when you compose tables for accessibility. But I think that this covers the 80% of cases. Now, I am not a software vendor, okay? So I will talk about the software tool that I use most for checking and make quality accessible content, and it's MadeToTag. MadeToTag is a plugin for InDesign to make accessible PDF and PDF UA. InDesign itself is capable of creating tagged PDF and accessible PDF, but it's not enough to create a PDF UA certified PDF. And so MadeToTag add a set of tools on top of InDesign to create and output a PDF UA file. It has a set of tools, 7 guided steps to create a PDF UA, a tagged PDF, an accessible PDF, starting from scratch, from a normal document to the end. So there are a lot of tools that you can use to manage tables and paragraph and articles and reading order and so on. And there are some specific tools for the various situations, and you can find while you are composing your layout. So this is just an example. There is a specific tool for fixing the tables, okay, for setting the headers, for tagging the headers of the table, and the vertical headers, the horizontal headers, and also to identify the tables that are not real tables, that are layout tables. You can mark them and tag them as layout table or find alternative for them. And of course, this is just an example of the tools that you have to deal with when you create an accessible file, some automation to locate soft returns, and lists that are composed without using the correct tools, and tools for reviewing the alternate text of the images, and so on. And finally, there is a visual feedback for the tags on the page. And that's important to identify at a glance the headers, the tables, the paragraphs. That's very important on long documents where you have to work with a lot of different situations on the page, like this illustrated school book. Okay, there are much more functionalities on MadeToTag, but these are the most important for fixing and creating accessibility. A trial download is available on the Exaio website.
Thank you, Damiano. So we're going to begin to answer the questions submitted against this presentation, and you can feel free to submit questions through the question pod. So the first question that we have here, when infographics are used in a table, is it considered okay because it has alt text and those using a screen reader will hear the same information someone else would see?
Okay, infographics is a chapter itself. There are good fonts for that, and fonts designed for that offers infographics along with typographic content. In general, it is okay if the content preserve the letters, the characters of the content. Okay, they must be there must be a text to be read. In the example that I shown before, there was a text that I could make accessible and a graphic element with a certain color, and that's fine. It's fine if there is a taggable text.
Okay. So next question, what are your thoughts about table summaries? Are they necessary?
Table summaries?
Yep.
Well, you mean content along with table that describes the content of the table? Is that what?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. The question, Karen, would you like to mention your question a little further? I can unmute you if you'd like. I think the question question pertained to whether or not table summaries are necessary to making a table accessible, at least as I read the
no,
question.
they are not necessary. Not necessary when a table is well composed and it's tagged the proper way. It's good for accessibility.
Okay.
Well, it's long. You know, there are two levels of good accessibility. One is the technical level, and the other is the content level. So you can check the technical level. If a table is well tagged, it's fine for the technical level. If it has a good structure, an understandable structure for the reader, is also good in terms of accessibility.
Okay. A number of other questions here coming in. Quick first question, next question, I should say. Any suggestions on how to convince authors to create simple tables rather than the complex tables that they seem to love?
Yeah, that's something that is giving me and us a lot of work, I think. And with all the customers that I'm working with, for accessibility, the first step is always talk with the creators and explain them. Okay, I found very useful to explain to content creators that we are doing something different, something more for the content, showing or presenting the whole process. Okay, possibly showing some tools that blind people use to read the content.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to be soft in this because sometimes authors are used to create very complex table, and they need them. They need those complex table to explain the content, and sometimes a content table can be disassembled, and it takes 5 pages of text to disassemble a complex table. But it can be done step by step. It's a long process. Normally it takes months or years of work with publishers. Well, I think it can be done. It should be done over time.
Mm-hmm. So in your slide 13, you point out measurement units should go. What did you mean by measurement units go into cells rather than in headers? So you gave the example of currency.
Okay. Well, I can go back, to the slide. Yeah. It's where I talked about also overloaded headers. Okay, this is the good example of using measurement units in tables where grams is into the cell. We're talking about the third column, weight. Okay, grams is into the cell, so follows the content of the cell. It's not part of the description. And the bad example was on slide 11. Okay. This is how it should not be. So for example, pH and also SR, CVR, %R, those units should be into cells and repeated on every cell.
Mm-hmm. So it's a couple of questioners are pointing out that they say in Acrobat PDF Checker, it says that each table must have a table summary. Do you have any comment on that?
Well, honestly, I have to check what the what accessibility checker.
I think it does have that checkbox, and I guess whatever I'd say to somebody is uncheck that box.
Okay. Okay.
It's certainly not a accessibility requirement in my understanding, a requirement per se. Could you, let's see, what's another question here? Can you explain in a few words what's likely to happen when a screen reader has to deal with grouped cells, row span and col span?
Well, the screen reader we have to make this distinction between reading the screen or accessing the content. When you're reading the screen with some easy tools like Acrobat Reader or Siri or some of those tools, the content is just read in the order it is found on the screen. But when a blind person accesses the table, is probably not reading in the same order it appears on the page. And we do that every day when you access a table, when you read a table. You have a look at the table and you check, for example, the headers, or you check the first column to find the content that is interesting for you. And then you go and read that specific rows or that specific column. And so it happens when you access the table with specific tools for accessibility. And when you find a merged table, a couple of merged cells or two or more merged cells, you lose your connection with the headers. Okay, I can tell you that there is a table with the first column exposing the article number, and the second column the product number, and then I don't know, the barcode. And then we start to read the table, and at some point you find that a row has two cells instead of three, because two of them are merged. And you don't know at that point if the cell is referring to the article number or the product number. You have no reference for that.